thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Jones and I'm a Deputy Director at Learning and Work Institute. And as Naomi was just saying, a big welcome to all of you this morning for our Employment and Skills Summit, focusing on where next for employment support. Our panel sessions will focus on supporting people into work, to stay in work and to progress in work. So let's just take a look at the programme. In a minute, Naomi Clayton, Deputy Director at Learning and Work Institute, will give the keynote speech, followed by a brief Q&A session. This is a change to the billing, as Stephen Evans is unfortunately able to join us today. At 10 a.m, our first panel is on delivering full employment and expanding the workforce and supporting people who want to work. After a short break, our second plenary session will focus on good work and supporting people to progress in work, including through upskilling. At midday, we have 3 breakout sessions to choose from: achieving better outcomes for young people, supporting labour market participation through essential skills, and thirdly, supporting people with health conditions. Joining links for these breakout sessions are in the programme on our website, and the link will be shared in the chat for you. During both plenary sessions and breakouts, please share any questions that you have in the Q&A function. A big thank you to our sponsors, Clarion Futures, Youth Futures Foundation, Edge Foundation and City and Guilds. If you're on social media, please use the hashtag EmpSkills23. And just before I introduce our keynote speaker, a quick reminder that nominations for our Festival of Learning Awards opened a couple of weeks ago. We're looking for inspirational individuals, providers, projects and employers who have demonstrated a commitment to adult learning, skills and training. This includes innovative learning providers working in partnership and engaging communities, employers supporting workers to upskill and progress, and individuals engaging in learning to transform their lives. Nominations close on the 2nd of February. And all details are on our website. And again, we will be sharing a link in the chat. So I just wanted now to welcome our keynote speaker, Naomi Clayton, as I said, who's a Deputy Director at Learning and Work Institute. Naomi has more than 15 years experience in policy and research, specialisms in employment, skills and labour market disadvantage issues. Prior to joining L&W, Naomi was Deputy Director at the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth and Policy and Research Manager at Centre for Cities. She's worked with partners across the UK to support them to use evidence and demonstrate impact through the implementation of skills strategies, youth employment support and in-work progression pilots and the development of local industrial strategies. So big welcome, Naomi, and yes, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Emily. And good morning, everybody. I'm going to pick up from yesterday's autumn statement. So the big picture from yesterday's autumn statement and the OBR forecasts is that the growth outlook has weakened. Inflation is expected to stay higher for longer, and living standards are forecast to be 3.5% lower next year than pre-pandemic, which marks the largest reduction in living standards since the 1950s. The government's Back to Work plans announced last week to widen employment support for people who are out of work is welcome. And there's lots to welcome with the expansion of universal support, additional individual placement and support places, and testing new ways to better join up work and health through initiatives like the Work Well pilots. But the autumn statement also introduced changes to the work capability assessment, subjecting more people to conditionality and tougher sanctions. We think that focusing on widening employment support rather than tightening benefits is more likely to get people back to work. So I'm going to talk through why we think we should be aiming higher, who needs support, how well the system is working, alongside some initial reactions to the government's latest measures, and where we think the focus should be. So if we move on to the first slide, it's clear that getting more people into work remains a priority for government, and it should be a priority. But we think that the government should have an ambition to match some of the top performing countries internationally. The UK's employment rate is high by international and historic standards, but the UK is the only G7 country to have a lower employment rate than pre-pandemic, largely as a result of a rise in economic inactivity. As you can see on this chart here, the UK is the orange line on this chart, which shows you that of these countries in the G7 and compared to the European Union, the UK is the only country where economic inactivity is still above pre-pandemic levels. And just a note, this is based on data from the Labour Force survey. The Bank of England analysis finds that the LFS may be overestimating employment and participation rates by around 0.4 percentage points in the UK. So if anything, inactivity rates may be higher. But of course, this isn't just about the recovery from the pandemic. Increasing the employment rate can help boost economic growth. If we go to the next slide, our analysis suggests that an 80% employment rate matching high-performing countries like Iceland and the Netherlands, which you see on the left-hand side of this chart, would mean 1.7 million more people in work and boost the economy by 23 billion per year. So there's a real kind of economic prize to supporting more people into work. The pandemic saw the fastest 3-year increase in economic inactivity since the early 1990s, which led, as we've seen in lots of the kind of headlines, to significant labour shortages. But there's also a long-term imperative to do and demographic imperative to do more to help people find work if we're to avoid labour shortages in the decades ahead. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the population projections for different decades. By the 2040s, there will be 2.3 people of working age for every person above the state pension age, down from 3.5 in the 2010s. And 1.4 million more older people will retire in the next 13 years than young people will enter the workplace. And at the same time, there's over 1.7 million people who want to work, but who are outside the workforce. So it's really key to avoiding long-term labour shortages, as well as addressing some of the challenges that have been brought by the pandemic. And getting more people into work would also reduce benefit spend. The OBR projects that spending on disability-related benefits now exceeds 1% of GDP, up from 0.5% in 2014-15. It's set to rise sharply this year and is forecast to rise by an average of 11.3 billion a year by the end of the decade. And this increase is a product of the rising prevalence of disability, insufficient employment support, and other issues such as employer attitudes and skills, and most recently, high inflation. It's not because benefits have become more generous. The real terms value of unemployment benefits is at its lowest since the 1990s, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Trussell Trust estimate that it would cost an extra 22 billion per year to ensure that the basic rate of universal credit meets the cost of essentials. We've seen changes to the work capability assessment that were announced in yesterday's autumn statement, which essentially changes the descriptors which define somebody's ability to work and raises the bar for being assessed as having a more severe incapacity, are estimated by the OBR to lead to 370,000 fewer people being in the more severe incapacity group and losing approximately £5,000 per year. So that's 370,000 fewer people in that group by 2019, which is estimated to save around £1 billion per year. And I'll come back to this later. But having an adequate safety net is really important to ensuring people can meet their basic costs, that they're not pushed harder and further into poverty, and that their health isn't impacted, making it harder to get back into work. So if we go on to the next slide, I want to talk a bit about what we know about who is out of work and who is on out of work benefits. And our report published earlier this week set out to shine more light on this. We know that people are still leaving the labour market for a variety of reasons, but the most common reason people stay out of work is long-term sickness. So 500,000 more people are economically inactive due to long-term sickness since the beginning of 2019. And this is partly driven by the rise of mental health conditions. On the last count, there were 2.6 million people economically inactive due to long-term sickness. And if we look at this chart, we can see that we have some big, long-standing participation gaps. So this chart shows the economic activity rate or the participation rate and level gaps for different groups. And if we focus on employment within that, I think that shows the kind of scale of the challenge that we're talking about here. So closing the ethnic minority employment gap would mean an extra 350,000 more people in work. Closing the disability employment gap rate, which is on the left-hand side of this chart, would mean an extra 2.4 million more people in work. So we need to be working to address some of these longer standing participation gaps, with a focus on people with disabilities and those kind of long-term health conditions. If we go to the next slide, we can see that the trends that we see from the labour force survey, notwithstanding the issues with LFS data at the moment, broadly align with the trends in benefits data. And this was the focus of our report that was published earlier this week. And our estimates suggest that around 5.5 million people are in receipt of out-of-work benefits in Great Britain. And alongside those who are unemployed and required to search for work, and those with caring responsibilities, by far the largest group here, represented in the dark blue area on this chart, is the people who are not required to search for work due to sickness or disability. So at the moment, we estimate there's around 3.2 million people in this group. And the biggest reasons, the biggest kind of health-related reasons that people are economically inactive or on health benefits are mental health conditions and musculoskeletal conditions. And surveys suggest lots of these people want to work. Lots of people are unable to work, but to support those who could work and that want to work, we do need more specialist employment support that can address people's needs. So how well is the system working? If we move to the next slide, we can see from our analysis, it shows that people who are unemployed are 10 times more likely to be in work 6 months later than those who are economically inactive when we exclude students. So the chart on the top here shows the proportion of unemployed people who are in work 2 quarters later, which is around a third when we're looking at unemployed people. And that's risen since 2010, when the economy was in recession. The chart on the bottom looks at people who are economically inactive. And it shows that when we exclude students, only around 3% of people who are economically inactive are in work 6 months later. So kind of 2 quarters later in the survey. If we look at the kind of orange line on that bottom chart, it shows that only around 1% of people who are economically inactive due to long-term sickness are in work 6 months later. So people who are out of work due to long-term sickness or disability are far more likely to stay economically inactive. And this reflects lack of regular contact and lack of employment support for those who want to work. We know that just 1 in 10 out of work older people or disabled people get help to find work each year. If we go to the next slide, the Chancellor announced that the government has doubled the number of yearly places available on universal support to 100,000, which of course is welcome. And universal support is designed to match people who are long-term sick and disabled with suitable vacancies. And there's focus on people who are on out of work benefits but not receiving support. And of course, this is welcome, and we calculate that it represents a 20% increase in the number of disabled people getting employment support each year. But if we put that in the context of the number of people number of disabled people who are out of work, which this chart, the bar on the left-hand side demonstrates, we can see that actually the kind of increase and increase in placements in universal support will only increase the number of out of work disabled people getting employment support by a couple of percentage points, so rising from 10% to 12%. That leaves a lot of people who are not accessing support each year. Of course, we've also seen the announcement of other measures, such as the expansion of the individual placement and support, which is welcome because it's been demonstrated to be very effective where it works more. But that amounts to an additional 20,000 per year. And within all of this, the work and health programme is due to come to an end in 24-25. And then, of course, you've got the changes to the work capability assessment, which is estimated to reduce the numbers in the most severe incapacity category and access to those additional payments by around 370,000. but the OBR estimates that only around 10,000 of those people are expected to move into work. So very important within all of this is that people are able to access specialist employment support that can address their needs. If we move on to the next slide, the Chancellor also announced that the government is strengthening the way that the sanctions regime is applied. But the evidence on the effectiveness of sanctions is limited and mixed. So it may increase employment, but it may also possibly lead to short-term poorer quality work or displacement onto other benefits. And it can affect people's health. And a benefit sanction at least partly reflects a failure to support to effectively engage people. And we know that the rules and requirements are already extremely strict for unemployed people. And this chart here just shows the proportion of eligible claimants that are subject to a benefit sanction. It's risen from around 4% in the mid-2000s to around 5 to 6% in the 2010s to around just under 8% in May 2023. And as we saw, the biggest groups in receipt of out-of-work benefits are those who are disabled and with caring responsibilities. And the evidence on the effectiveness of conditionality and sanctions for this group is limited. It's likely that the best way to support more people in these groups into work is through engagement and support rather than through conditionality and sanctions. So just onto my final slide. Overall, the OBR estimates that the measures introduced by the government around kind of welfare reform and widening employment support will increase employment by around 50,000. But when we look at that in kind of context of some of these numbers of people who are economically inactive, that's around 3% of the total number of people who are economically inactive who want to work. So there's still much further to go. And we think the focus really needs to be on widening and deepening support, not narrowing and restricting benefit rules. We also think that we need better data and research on the benefit system and sanctions, which includes looking at the options and the research for the options on disability benefits reform and better understanding the role of conditionality and impact of sanctions on different groups. And also say we need better use of evidence. So the existing evidence, as I've said, on sanctions doesn't support the increased use of sanctions as a means to getting people into work, particularly with those with disabilities and health conditions. And sanctions are a sign of failure to engage people and really should be a last resort. Government have also announced that they'll be rolling out mandatory work placement trials. And the government's own evidence from a pilot for Help to Work showed that a similar approach didn't increase employment outcomes. To really change the dial on this, we need a plan for full employment that includes working with employers on job design and recruitment strategies, creating more flexible jobs, more disability-friendly workplaces. It can't all be supply side. And we need to invest in health, skills, childcare, and of course, widen access to employment support. And as we'll be talking about later, we also need to support people into good work too. So I will stop there, but very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and apologies for the technical hitch when I tried to introduce you earlier. Thank you so much for that. There was a huge amount of information there. And I think a lot of those themes and that information will be picked up through the panels as well that we have today. So if we don't get to your questions now, please do think about whether they are suitable for panels to pick up later on. We've got a few questions in the chat. I'm going to see what we can get through in the next 3 minutes. So the first one I'm going to ask you is an important one as we think about the relationship between work and health and the drivers you just described, or the need to support more people with health conditions back into the workplace. Patrick's asked, what is the employer risk or liability of taking on people that have long-term health conditions? Does this need to be an open conversation that addresses responsibility and of expectations of employers and employees in terms of being at work? And what sort of work do these people that have long-term health conditions want to do, or is that not clear yet?
Right, thank you. I think, yeah, no, it's a good question, and I absolutely think we need to be focusing more on the employer side and the role of employers in creating more kind of flexible jobs and helping people who have disabilities and health conditions to access and stay in work. There's been a lot of talk in the headlines recently about, you know, disabled people taking jobs where they can work from home, and when we know not all jobs can be done remotely and from the home. So I think we need to be thinking more kind of widely about how we improve access to employment and work with employers to do that. And I think within that, we need to look at the role of things like access to work. I think there's a debate in terms of, you know, kind of how that might be used to support more employers to really kind of understand how they can support people to manage kind of health conditions and disabilities and stay in work. We also need to look at the role of line managers, because they play an integral role in supporting people to stay in work too. So I think there's lots more that we can do. There's lots more we can do with existing programs like Access to Work and on the occupational health side. But absolutely, we can't just kind of limit action to this kind of supply side and looking at kind of employment support measures. We absolutely need to be much more focused on the role of employers.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Amy. Now, there are actually quite a number of questions for you, which but we have completely run out of time, so I'm afraid we can't get to them here, but I'm sure you'll be taking a look at those in the question and answer bit as well. Thank you so much again. We are now going to our first plenary session. This is around delivering full employment. The session is going to be chaired by Sam Afanzo-Windet, who is Learning and Work's Deputy Director. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Naomi. I hope everyone can hear me okay. If not, I'm sure someone will tell me. What a time to be holding a summit on employment support. I think fantastic timing with everybody talking about the autumn statement yesterday. It's a fast-paced world, and we're going to get a lot of great reflections this morning, not only from our fantastic Deputy Director, Naomi Clayton, as we've just heard, but from our first panel. So we've got a great first panel lined up. We've got Elizabeth Taylor, the Chief Executive of IRSA, Employment Related Services Association. We have David Finch, the Assistant Director at the Health Foundation. We have Nick Whitten-Dowd, Assistant Director for Education, Skills and Work at Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and also Barry Fletcher, the Chief Executive of the Youth Futures Foundation. So we're going to get some really great different views from all of them, and we're going to get the chance for questions. So I will actually look at some of the questions that you posed to Naomi Clayton. I've written some of them, scribbled some of them down on my notepad that I can pose to the panelists as well. So we will get a chance to address some of those in this panel. But I've also got some of my own, because that's the chair's prerogative, isn't it? But without further ado, I mean, Naomi Clayton has really well set out the challenges that we face and the latest developments. So I won't go over that. I'm going to move directly on to Elizabeth Taylor, who's going to give us a bit of a state of the nation, what's happening in the world of employment support. So not the easiest job when it's been quite a changing picture over the last 24 hours. But Elizabeth, over to you to give us a bit of an overview.
Unmuting will help. Thanks, Sam. I think, first of all, it's worth talking about the state of the nation and a little bit of a reflection that we've actually got 4 nations, and there are things that we can learn from the others. And I think the first thing that I would say is, in terms of the employment support sector, we had some really great announcements that were actually made last week, just ahead of the autumn statement, about the extension of the Restart programme for 2 years. National provision is incredibly important. National provision is the thing that means that every job seeker has the opportunity to take up the quality offer, and there's no postcode lottery, and it doesn't matter where you live, you will get quality employment support outside of that, the job centre structure. So there are things we can learn. In Scotland, as Fair Start comes to an end, then last national provision, everything is being devolved down to a really local level. I could talk for 5 minutes about that, I won't, but I think we should reflect on that this has not been an easy transition. And in Northern Ireland, things are already devolved down to a local authority area, but the funding that's gone with that devolved commissioning hasn't necessarily worked for the employment support sector. So in that context, we look a little bit at England and Wales now. And the Restart extension for 2 years gives the employment support sector the security it needed to deliver the best provisions for job seekers. We've seen things from the National Audit Office and the Public Affairs Committee that provided evidence that actually having a sector that exists at a certain level is more cost effective for Treasury than reducing the sector and building it back up again if there's an economic shock or there's a new cohort of people that they want to focus on. So 2 years extension to Restart, really, really welcome. And what we will see now is final referrals to Restart in the summer of 2026. But we have to put that alongside the end of the Work and Health programme, where the last referrals will be in September 24, there's pre-employment support till December 25, and light touching work support till September 26. So my observation on this is there's some really good things coming through with the autumn statement and the back to work announcements, the 2.6 million investment in the employment support sector over 5 years. But we're going to see the pilots. We're going to see the pilots. We're going to see, the Work Well pilots. We're seeing things that are being learnt from IPS, from what happens when you use the supported employment model on universal support. We've got to get those things up, running, delivered, evaluated, so that in 2026, when we have a new national provision procured, we have learned from those things. And I just worry sometimes that announcements, whilst they're really good, come a little bit too late. So universal support will be the other national provision. Again, I think that needs to be procured really early in 24 and not go far into the year. I worry about what a general election could mean for that if it's not been procured and up and running. Very welcome to see that double to 100,000, and I think some really sensible decisions being made about how you take that national provision and you recruit it and you procure and deliver it on a local level using some functional economic areas, and please not down to local authorities at the level that we've done with SPF. So I'll talk, 5 minutes, soon gone. SPF, Shared Prosperity Fund, should be completely overhauled. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for people and skills in particular. I look at the 24 local authorities, some of which are in the most deprived areas, that didn't put people and skills in their investment plans. So let's learn from this first round of SPF. Let's look at what these functional economic areas are going to be. And then finally, in terms of the other gaps that I think are missing, what are we going to do about youth? Big focus on long-term unemployed, people with health conditions. I know we're going to hear from Barry soon, but please, let's have a better focus on youth employment provision. And finally, they talk about mandatory work experience placements. It would be much better off joining up employment and skills so that people had the right skills, the right capability to be attractive to employers if that kind of work experience, which can be a wonderful thing, but has to be done in the right way. So I hope that's a good 5 minutes. Sam, hand back to you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. An outline there with plenty for us to dig into. Some things continuing, lots of things starting, some things untested, some things have been tested, some things are expanding. Lot of change, as always, Elizabeth. That's always the continuum. So yeah, we'll come back for questions at the end. So think of your questions for Elizabeth and I'll pose them to her afterwards. We're going to move on now to David Finch, talking about the link between poor health and inactivity, so economic inactivity, which has been a big focus of what Naomi was talking about earlier. Over to you, David.
Great, thank you. And also thank you for inviting me to speak. As others have said, there's even more to talk about given what's been announced recently and in the autumn statement. I'd just say, for those not aware, the Health Foundation is an independent charity, and we're a funder who, as well as funding different bits of activity, also have our own policy functions. And our sort of main mission, particularly relevant to this area, is about improving health and reducing inequalities. As Sam said, I would probably talk a little bit broader than just inactivity, and it's partly just to understand some of the links between work and health and some of the recent trends, because these really, I think, start to point to the types of supports that are needed, and the type of activity that can help people to be in work and stay in good health. I think, as you're probably all aware, but I think it is worth emphasising because it can get lost at times, that work is a really key determinant of health, and it's really crucial to supporting good health. And it's not just the income that work can bring to people, which helps to support living standards, but it's also the day-to-day structure that work can provide, the opportunities for socialising and status, which is why kind of work quality can be quite important. And in contrast, the lack of employment is really strongly linked to worse health outcomes. I think one caveat here is around the quality of work. So if work isn't of sufficient quality, and that can be about autonomy and the control that people have over their roles at work, as well as the kind of insecurity element of kind of varying hours or shift patterns, then it can be damaging to health, particularly mental health. And in some instances, low quality work has actually been shown to be as bad for health as unemployment can be. So making sure that people are in good quality work is also really key for supporting good health. And clearly, I suppose what we're seeing a lot of at the moment is more the consequences of poor health in the working age population. Poor health acts as a barrier to work, and we're seeing that with the kind of 2.6 million out of the labour market now, who report that's due to their long-term health conditions. And I suppose it's also important to think in a wider context that this does reflect, although the big increase has been seen since the pandemic, it does reflect a wider increase in prevalence of ill health in the working age population going back over a decade. And that some of our recent research, which has projected forwards the health of the the UK population suggests there'll be another 500,000 people of working age with a severe health condition by 2030. So it's not something going away, and it's going to be something we need to get the right sort of long-term approaches in place to support. As I think it's been mentioned, you're obviously seeing this increased focus from government, and while a lot of that employment support does sort of go in the right direction, things like universal support, they are fairly small in scale, and they're coming in quite gradually, and ultimately, as I think has already been covered to some extent, they're not going to do a lot for employment, particularly in the near term, and much of that drive is being driven by savings, like the changes to descriptors in the work capability assessment, which is effectively going to remove higher levels of entitlement from sort of over, I think it's getting on for close to 400,000 people by 2026. And I think what we also need to be aware of is the kind of big rise in the number of people who are in work with a work limiting condition, which is now up to around 3.7 million, and particularly seeing big rises in 16 to 34-year-olds mental health conditions. So I think what really that points towards is this need to take an approach that isn't just about getting people who are out of work with long-term health conditions back into work. It's about helping people already in work with health conditions to stay in work, and then also helping to support people who to keep their health in a good state in the first place. And probably the kind of three main areas of focus there. I mean, we've talked a bit about that kind of intensive support already that people need who they're out of work and moving them back in. And I think the real issue there so far is that kind of the mixing of that with the threat of sanctions and the speed at which those things are being rolled out by government. I think there's, for people in work, there's been talk of occupational health services, which is one way of helping, but I think not enough about making sure people are keeping contact with employees who are off sick, offering a route back to work, and also considering adaptations to job design to help them return. And then finally, just thinking about keeping people healthy in the first place. Clearly, there are things employers can do, which is about hazards and safety, but also kind of thinking about quality of work on offer. But we know it's not all about employers, and that government have a big role to play there. And that's why I think it's important, as we saw in the autumn statement, about keeping benefits rising in line with inflation to support people through the cost of living crisis, which is having an impact on health. And I will just finish by saying that really, I think there is this need to get an understanding of all these issues in the round, particularly given policy failure to get to grips with this over the last few decades. And that's why we are currently setting up a commission for healthier working lives to explore these issues and come up with that policy programme. It's something really keen for I suppose everyone here to be engaged with as we take that forward in future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. A really great overview of some of the key areas there, again, that I'm sure we will discuss in the Q&A. Thank you very much. Moving on to Nick Whitten-Dowd, she's going to talk about what's happening in Greater Manchester and what the Greater Manchester Combined Authority is doing, particularly around helping those furthest from the labour market to move into work. So, Nick, if you can join us, that's great. You've got some slides. There we go.
I have got some slides because I'm not going to talk through them all in detail, but particularly to make a couple of points, really. So good morning, everyone, and thanks, Sam. Great to have the opportunity to speak at this event today and just take you on a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of what we're doing in Greater Manchester around our Working Well programmes. Working Well sounds a bit like work well. It isn't work well, and that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But Working Well is part of our development towards our integrated technical education, employment and skills city region. And earlier, it's about how do we integrate all elements of that employment and skills sector to support people into work and into good work and to progress in work. So as I say, just pop the slide on. Thank you. Thank you. So what we're talking about here is Working Well, and Working Well is about a whole population approach to health, skills and employment in Greater Manchester. And currently, when we talk about Working Well, we're talking about programmes that are commissioned by the Combined Authority in Greater Manchester. Some of that is devolved funding, like the Work and Health Programme. Other is more local funding from our local NHSGM, or in fact from the CA itself. But it started a long time ago. It was a small pilot back in 2014, which was kind of challenging the work programme at the time and looking at people with multiple disadvantage and building that support to create a case for devolution and employment support to be more holistic in Greater Manchester. We've developed, as we've moved on, it into a system rather than individual siloed programs, and it's some of that is test and learn, but what we try to do is span that whole spectrum of need, from people with disability, long-term health conditions, additional needs, through to long-term unemployed, and support those people through the range of programs, which I'll come to in a minute. Since 2014, we've supported over 70,000 residents of Greater Manchester towards work, and over 25,000 of those have found employment. And I think it is that specialist support that they've been able to have through our Working Well programs. And again, earlier speakers talked about how people, they need that intensive, they need specialist work support to help them move into employment. And at the heart of this is some principles around a key model worker one-to-one, and actually how do we integrate with the wider GM system. And that integration is about the employer element and also the referral routes, which is a big thing that's changing. If we pop the slide on. So at the moment, we've got 5 live programs. I'm not going to talk through these because I'm very conscious of time, but they're everything from Work and Health, the Pioneer Programme, IPSPC, and then how we're utilising our SPF funding through Support to Succeed, and actually a community grants approach, which builds our referral routes. Those are our 5 current programmes, but they sit within a very complicated landscape. If we pop the slide on, and I'm not going to talk through this, but that just gives you a sense of all the employment and skills programs and the different commissioners within Greater Manchester. And it's not straightforward. It's not straightforward for our residents, and it's definitely not straightforward for our employers. So we are working, and if we just pop the slide on to my last slide, we are working to join up the system much more, that makes it easier to navigate. We want to be absolutely clear about who, how, and why we're supporting particular groups of people, and how we're making best use of public funds, whatever their source. We want all employment and health related employment support in Greater Manchester to work and adhere to a single set of principles. So what we create is not siloed programs, but is actually a working well system that is consistent whether programs are stopping and starting. And we want to look to a much simplified referral process. We've had the luxury, I use that wryly, but we've had the luxury of JCP referrals up till now, and the new look, the new programs that are coming through are very much different referral routes, through health, through community groups, and through community organisations. So we've got a lot of work to go, but we've got a really good basis, and I'll leave it there ready for questions, I think. Thank you, Sam.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Nick. Some good complicated slides there. Good to see. Very useful. Thank you. And on to our last panelist, last but not least, of course, is Barry Fletcher. He's going to talk a bit about the barriers faced by young people who are economically inactive in particular, and what works to help young people move towards and into work. So Barry, take us through that.
Thank you very much, Sam. Lovely to see everyone. Hope you're all well. So just wanted to start off by giving you a bit of a sense of the scale of the issue that we're talking about. So there was some really useful overview from Naomi earlier about the wider position, but when we look at young people specifically, as of the latest data, and there are some issues with the ONS data at the moment, so this is as of August, there were 794,000 young people who are not in education, employment and training. And of those, 467,000 are economically inactive. Now, over the last 3 years or so, post-pandemic, there's been understandably a big focus on the growing numbers of those who are 50 plus, who are out of work and have left the labour market, but a pretty limited focus on young people. And we think that's, as you might expect, a pretty fundamental issue, because the challenge facing young people has increased. And also we've seen a pretty sizable growth in numbers from a post-pandemic drop. And over this last couple of years, that's grown by 23%. So we've seen a 23% growth in NEET over this last 2 years. And we're actually seeing more young people being NEET now than were pre-pandemic. Now, when we look at that kind of issue of focusing on young people, this isn't a kind of either or. This isn't saying we shouldn't be worried about those who are 50 plus, or we absolutely should be. But we've done some analysis, and what you can actually see in that analysis is that actually, when you look at that inactive population, those young people who are inactive, actually more of those young people want to work or want to work in the near future than the absolute number who want to do that who are over 50. Even though that group of over 50s who are inactive is actually 5 times as big. So what we would say is that actually an active focus on this group is going to likely lead to more positive outcomes than if your sole focus is on those who are 50 plus. And we also know that those economic benefits are massive. So we did a piece of work last year with PwC, which highlighted significant economic benefits from addressing our NEET challenge. And we updated that this year to say that if we could reach the lowest NEET level in the OECD, and that's currently the Netherlands, we would see a £69 billion benefit to the UK economy. Now, when we look at barriers and we talk about barriers, many of those barriers are the same for young people as they are for those who are older. You know, especially the growth of ill health. We've seen almost a doubling of those who have ill health among young people who are out of work, and especially mental health, which is even greater among young people. You know, among those who are NEET, mental health rates are 3 times as high as they are for those who are not. Now, we also know that specific groups of young people, especially the most marginalised, tend to see poorer outcomes. So if you're care experienced, you're 4 times more likely to be NEET than others. So what works? So we've developed our Youth Employment Toolkit, which highlights a number of interventions, so 7 interventions that we've tested and looked at through the global evidence base. So this is based on the best evidence of what works. So looking at RCTs, QEDs, etc., which really show causal impact. And what they highlight is that vocational training, both on and off the job, really make a significant impact, as do apprenticeships. But what we've seen over the last couple of years is actually we've seen a drop in the number of under-19s doing apprenticeships. We've seen issues that Elizabeth highlighted around the transition from ESF to UK SBF being really fragmented. And our biggest concern is that although there clearly are programs that make a difference, and we're doing a lot of work to test and trial which make the biggest difference, actually most young people don't access those programs. So only of those young people in that total number of NEET, only 35% of them are on universal credit, and nearly all our eligibility criteria for programs are based on that, apart from some of the positive programs that are often run locally, some of those programs coming through SBF. So our argument is that yes, we need to focus on what works, we need to focus on getting more young people on those programs, but we really need to focus on widening that eligibility, especially to things like youth hubs, making sure that more young people are able to access apprenticeships, certainly looking at how we look at the funding of that, but also looking at how we integrate support more widely, especially around mental health. So some of the good approaches that have been taken around things like IAPT, looking at how you extend some of those things like CAMS, so that actually we can see more young people getting better support earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. Fantastic. So now we're on to the questions, and I'm going to get us started with something that you said, Nick. Really, you know, it hits home between what we've heard from all of the panelists, lots of acronyms, lots of different program names, lots of different things that have been talked about. But Nick, you said it's complicated. It's a complicated landscape in employment support, just in Greater Manchester. And I wondered, I'd like to ask the panelists a little bit about that. How complicated is the employment support landscape at the moment for job seekers? For providers, for local authorities, for employers in particular, is what's been announced in recent by the government yesterday and last week, back to work, is that going to make it easier? Are we going to see a less complex landscape as we move forward? I'd really like to get your thoughts on that. I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth, because I can, and because it's been a while since you last spoke. So Elizabeth, I'll come to you first, if you're still there. There you are.
Takes too long to start the video and unmute, sorry. I think the landscape will still be complex. However, if we really do build this integration between health provision and employment support, it could in fact be much easier to navigate. So for people that are on universal credit, they will have those relationships with the job centre that gets them onto things like Restart, the last tranche of people onto the work and health programme. How people will get to universal support is still being talked about, but I've witnessed some really positive discussions about that. Yeah, working well again will be, you know, we will have to learn fast from those pilots. But the thing that I think is most important is the narrative that there was last week and at the autumn statement, that having to take up employment support, having to do work experience, some people getting benefits reduced, what's going to happen to work capability, that doesn't make any of it any easier. And so I think the challenge for the sector is to have a big rallying call that we are a really good place to be. We offer really good quality provision, tailored, getting people the right job at the right time, so that people want to come to the outsourced sector, whether it's national, local, devolved, provision, SPF, whatever. And I think, you know, that's going to be a big piece of work starting now and going through 24.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yes, it's not long ago in the history of the employment support sector where, you know, names of workfare and things like that were discussed, which isn't extremely helpful for employers. It isn't helpful for job seekers. It isn't helpful for providers. Nick, I mean, you posed this in your slide. It was a very busy slide which showed some of this complication. Do you think some of these announcements are going to simplify some of this landscape? Do you think it's adding complication? How's it looking in Greater Manchester?
It was a purposefully busy slide, I have to say, to make a point. I think it depends on the flexibility that government allows us with some of these new programs. So universal support, if we can utilize that program to tailor and target where we have gaps in other provision, to sit alongside but not duplicate what's happening at a local level, then I think it can begin to ease that complication. If we can match with our people and skills funding rather than have conflicting programs trying to support the same person or all targeting the same referral routes, whether that's within primary care, within mental health, within community organisations. So for me, the simplifying comes from how we integrate all these programs together and the systems around those programs. So, you know, I've worked in the skills sector as well for a long time, and we always talk about door knocking for employers, you know, door knocking to one person on apprenticeships, one on T-levels, one on boot camps, and one for work experience. And employers, they shut the door. And I can see, if we're not careful, that with a lot of community organisations where a lot of the reach for the economically inactive, particularly those that aren't engaging with JCP, don't have conditionality, don't need to go in, how we have to be careful that we don't cause them to shut their doors because we're asking too many times. And so I think done properly and with the right flexibilities, and we will be able to start to reduce that. And I think, you know, the partnerships with health, as others have said, are so critical, but also that relationship with DWP and JCP in a place are equally as important to ensure that the landscape doesn't become more complex.
So there is hope there, Nick, and you and Elizabeth both saying there is some hope there, as long as we're not knocking on the same doors of people who need support, that we're reaching, you know, new doors, and we're not knocking on the same doors of employers with all these different names and schemes. Yeah. Barry, from a young person's perspective, complicated, easy to get support? Is it going to get easier?
I think it is relatively complex, but our bigger concern is that actually the lack of support that exists. So I think actually, if we look at the plethora of different support structures, and see, my background is I spent a lot of time working in those areas, is that actually there's quite a lot, and some of the issue is how do you make sure people get to the right provision that works for them and provides that support at both from both local and national level. I think the issue for young people is, if you're a young person, you're 16 and you say haven't done very well in your GCSEs, actually we often end up not supporting people. Those pathways don't necessarily exist for young people if they don't find their way to, say, college or other support. We don't have that kind of wraparound structure to say, actually, how do we make sure that young people get onto a good path? And if we compare ourselves to other countries, and we've done some work on this and we're doing some further work next year, actually those countries that have the best systems for young people in terms of transition to work don't do that. They don't say, actually, you're 16, you haven't gone down that path, because we have a very good path for people. If they do really well in their GCSEs, they go on to A levels, T levels, and they go on to university. We have a great path for that, actually, and we have some world leading approaches to it. What we don't necessarily have is that same path if people haven't necessarily found their way there. And I think that is the gap that we're very honestly likely to see very high levels of need unless we address some of that gap.
Yeah, that gap in parity. Thanks, Barry. And David, do you have anything to add on this and the landscape as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, we fund a program called Economies for Healthier Lives, which is developing partnerships between public health teams and economic development teams at a local level. And they've been going for about 2 years now. I think it's running into its sort of third year. But one of the really big things that's come out of it is just how long it's taken them to understand even what their respective roles are at a local level, their systems, the type of language they use, and getting to a joint understanding before they can really get on with trying to develop a policy. So I think that is probably a fair barrier to actually getting on and seeing some movement with it, as well as the kind of work well pilots going through ICSs, which I would envisage they will have a similar issue in trying to actually understand that. And much of the feedback we get from there, although some of this is a bit anecdotal, but it does tend to be they're focusing very much on stretched funds to deliver health and social care in the local area. So they're kind of, I suppose, their wavelength to actually kind of be able to think about developing meaningful sort of employment-related pilots is potentially quite limited. I suppose the positive is that there's some funding attached that might help to get that attention focused onto the employment side of things a bit more.
Yeah, great. And I should add through Learning and Works research, we're big advocates of having more single pots of funding for devolved areas to be able to tie some of these together and know what's in the patch, and have some agreed outcomes that would deliver with that funding to try and tie more of this together. We've had a couple of questions, more looking at the employer side. So rather than that sort of big focus on claimants, which sort of came out a bit in that back to work and autumn statement, in the employer side, And one of the I think Julie's posted a question about, it's about employers knowing which doors to knock on, not just everybody knocking on the employer's door, and that there's a journey maybe for employers to go on as well. I just want to focus on that and your thoughts around what needs to happen with employers hand in hand over the coming months. If I come to Nick, if I come to you first.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I'd spotted sort of Julie's question, and absolutely, it's the one front door, isn't it? And I think we've been talking a lot about it in terms of claimants and people that are seeking work, but actually the flip side of that is the people that want workers, and how do they access that? So I think there's a lot more work to do in that space. In Greater Manchester, we do need to think about that. We need to build that engagement with employers, and actually there's the one front door element, but there's also that willingness that employers need to develop to be broader minded, perhaps in their recruitment, to think about things like job carving, to understand that they're not going to necessarily have a fully formed employee, but to recruit on potential as much as skill sets. And I think employers alongside individuals have a journey to go on, and will need to look at their workforce requirements more holistically, but more openly, and recognize the benefits that a more diverse workforce can bring to them, and look at how they can diversify that workforce, really.
Yeah, journey for everybody to go. But Barry, in terms of young people and your Youth Futures work with employers there, what do you see coming up?
Yeah, no, and I was going to mention this earlier on, but I ran out of time slightly. But I do think it's important we look at that system as a whole, and that's certainly something we're trying to do. I think there's a lot of focus, and the government announcements were very much aligned to this, about the young person or the adult who we need to support, and that's really important, and it really matters. But very honestly, even the best programs can only do so much when there are lots of other aspects that are impacting on it. So a couple of things I'd say on the employer side. One is that we're doing quite a lot of work, and have already done quite a lot of work to look at what are the recruitment and retention approaches can employers take that can increase inclusivity and open up this untapped talent pool. We did a piece of work with CIPD last year that looked at this to really understand what is it about those approaches, and there's quite a long list, so I won't go into it all now, but I think just direct people to that. And we're looking next year as well to do some trials with employers where we actually test out some of these different things. So, for example, the growth of anonymous applications. Are they really making a difference? Do they really help you to recruit more inclusively? Can they actually drive change? Because it shouldn't just be about how do young people get themselves ready for those opportunities, when we know, unfortunately, that there are challenges that they face in accessing that, which have to see change at the employer side. Now, also, I think, though, government needs to think more carefully about how it incentivizes employers to do some of these things, because it wants it to happen, and it wants it to occur, but it focuses nearly all of its attention on how do we make it work. So things like employer incentives, looking at national insurance, looking at different aspects that could be changed, because we shouldn't just look at those things differently. We need to look at them as a whole, and that is often not the case.
Yeah, that's looking at them in the round and not just pushing one side of the equation. David, do you have anything to add on the employer side?
Yeah, sure. And I think it does feel like the kind of overlooked role, particularly in this sort of policy that government has been announcing, beyond their kind of occupational health consultations that I think they responded back to yesterday. And I think really and I think something that we've noticed as well is there has been this really big recognition of health and sort of, I suppose, workforce health from business and employers, particularly since the pandemic. Some of that does seem to take in the form of a focus on kind of wellbeing programs and sort of that kind of more, I suppose, quite straightforward support at work, when I think the evidence does tend to point, and I think this was put into the Q&A, that or where there is evidence that management is actually really important, and it's getting back to that kind of good management. And that's something that I think historically hasn't been something we're great at in the UK. And it's particularly because that can create the kind of stress and strain that can lead to either mental health conditions or exacerbating maybe existing issues. But I suppose some of this goes back to sort of thinking about job design and quality management. I think a bit, as Nick said, kind of that like employers understanding what people can actually do and what types of roles they could fulfill, because I think there can sometimes be a bit of caution or possibly even like fear there of actually not understanding what it might mean to employ someone with a long-term health condition, and then keeping people attached to work, which is partly going back to things like statutory sick pay that don't really fit with the modern labour market, hasn't been properly reformed for a long time and has been seen to be quite inadequate. So I think there are things there where it's thinking more holistically about that, the role of the employer within the wider system, as Barry was talking about. And I think particularly, I mean, there's inevitably going to be a cost to providing this, and I think particularly small employers, it's probably always going to be a barrier for them to get there, which is why I think there is that need to understand the kind of role of the employer, but within what other local services or government can provide to help keep people in work and in good health. Yeah,
and what kind of support that can be provided to employers, not just to the people moving into work. And Elizabeth, thoughts on those employer relations and supporting employers? And also there was a question about you know, it's not just about moving people into work, but helping employers to keep people to sustain work. Yeah.
So Ursa runs an employer engagement forum, and we try to build that community of good practice about you know, what works with employers. But something that is continually said when we have employers who speak at the forum is that they don't care whether somebody's at the job centre or on Restart or on Work and Health programme. They just want the right person. And I think we've got to find a way that gets the right people to employers. And maybe we need to move beyond some of these exclusive relationships and work more closely with DWP's National Employment Partnership team. And we're having the right conversations, but we haven't quite got there yet. And my other thing I would say is that there's been a number of really sound pieces of work in the last year about universal credit and employers needing to understand what it means when somebody in their workforce is still on UC and what conditionality might come with that and that need to progress in work. And so I think things like Dr. Katie Jones at Manchester Met and people at Lancaster and Brighton and David Etherington at Staffordshire, they've got really good, solid pieces of evidence that I think we need to put in front of the current government and whatever comes in 24, because it could shape how these relationships are formed.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yes, I completely agree. So I've got one question left, and you've all got 1 minute to answer it. So it's got to be a pithy one. What's one big challenge and one big opportunity you see coming up in 2024? 2024 is going to be a busy year for everybody here. What's a big opportunity and a big challenge? Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you because you're on my screen.
Okay, I'd say making devolution work for the employment support services and for the people that we serve.
That's an opportunity and a challenge in itself.
It is, yeah.
That's the pithiest answer you could have come up with, Elizabeth. Thank you. I'm going to go down the line. I'm going to ask Nick, what do you see as the biggest challenge and biggest opportunity next year?
I think the biggest challenge is going to be getting the triage, the referral routes right into old programmes, new programmes, crossover programmes. But I think that's the opportunity as well. I think we have the opportunity to try and put something, working with JCP, working with our health services to get that right.
It's the sort of size of the prize, isn't it? If we do get these things right, then there will be huge opportunities. David.
So I think the challenge is really getting some of the sort of pilots and the plans that DWP have been setting out, really getting those moving in the next year because it requires that kind of cross-sector engagement and getting that happening at a time where things will still be quite strange and difficult across different services. I think opportunity is probably, I suppose, looking to an election, whenever that might be, and the fact that actually it gives an opportunity to start to do some of that sort of longer term thinking about what actually this system needs to look like to be effective.
Yeah, I agree. So some things may be held up and some things may move forward quite quickly with some of the changes next year. And Barry, what do you see from young people's perspective?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is ambition. Are we ambitious to say that actually having nearly 800,000 young people out of work is not good enough, and that we need to change that, and that it's not inevitable that that is the case, because it definitely isn't inevitable. And I think the opportunity that comes from that is a huge untapped talent pool of young people who can and want to work in the most cases, but the system needs to work better to help them do that.
2024, the year of ambition. I think we can all agree on that. There have been some other fantastic questions, and apologies that we've rattled through. We have covered a lot of areas within the questions that we've looked at, but there will be other opportunities during the summit to go into more detail on some of these areas, and particularly on the WCA and some of the sanctions reforms and some of those areas. I know that is top of mind for quite a few people. There has been a question about the slides, Nick, that you presented and the slides that we've had. All resources that we have available will be on the Learning and Work website. And also, if you've asked any questions about any evidence that Elizabeth, you mentioned some evidence on in-work support and so forth, then we'll grab that from you and we'll put the links on our Learning and Work website for everybody who's watching the summit. But it only goes for me to say a huge thank you on a fast-paced panel to Elizabeth, to David, to Nick and to Barry. Thank you so much for your contributions, both your presentations, but also your great discussion afterwards, and great perspectives that you brought to the morning. So thank you all very much. I'm going to hand over back to Naomi Phillips, I think, who's going to take us into the next session. Thank you, everybody.
Welcome back, everybody. My apologies again for ongoing tech issues, but I have now switched devices, so hopefully this will work much better. What a fantastic panel earlier, and we are straight on to another one. So we are now going to be talking about better access to good work and progression, and I'm really happy to hand over to my colleague Naomi Clayton, Deputy Director at Learning and Work Institute, who's going to chair this panel.
Lovely, thank you, Naomi. So we've focused a lot of the discussion this morning on supporting people to find and stay in work. And we're now going to shift to talking more about access to good work, to quality jobs and opportunities for progression. I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel to discuss these issues, and I'll introduce the panel as I invite them to give their introductory remarks. And I think there's lots to discuss on this topic, because it's a really, really important issue, but it also covers a range of different policy areas too. So we know that increases in the minimum wage have continued to reduce the prevalence of low pay, that the national minimum wage is a big success story, yet at the same time living standards have stagnated for millions since the 2008 financial crisis, and levels of progression from low pay are limited. Work is still the best way out of poverty, but it's becoming a less effective route and way out of poverty. And that's not principally a problem with hourly wages or the minimum wage, but how jobs are constructed. So hours and pay volatility and the insufficiency of hours in low paid work has contributed to concerns about the quality of work for many. It also means that 3 in 10 workers are in poverty, and the wellbeing premium for low paid workers has disappeared. So levels of job satisfaction have fallen for low-paid workers, and that partly relates to the lack of autonomy and control at work. So we've got some big challenges, and I'm really keen to hear the panelists' perspectives. So I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Ian Kaplan, who's Director for Employment, Skills and Youth Policy at the Department for Work and Pensions, who's going to spend kind of 5 minutes giving us an overview on DWP's employment and in-work support offer. So Ian, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Naomi. I hope you can see and hear me okay, because my computer's doing all sorts of funny things in the background, but we'll hope they're all right. And thank you so much for having me along. I've been really lucky to work with Learning Work Institute for a number of years, including in my previous guise when I used to work in the Department for Education on lots of these issues there as well. So it's always been a pleasure to work with you, and it's a fantastic part of this summit. So DWP, so one of our key strategic objectives is about building a more prosperous society by supporting people to enter and progress in work. And really critical to the design of universal credit is the fact that it is both an in-work and an out-of-work benefit. That's one of the major differentiators between it and our system. So I feel like we often talk a lot about the first of those things, but we don't talk about the second very much. So I'm going to try and put that right a bit this morning. There's a really compelling case for why we should care as a department about in-work progression. So in 2021, nearly 4 million jobs were low paid, so nearly 1 in 7 of all employee jobs. And we know how hard it can be for people to progress in jobs. So 5 out of 6 low paid people in 2006 were still in low pay a decade later. But clearly when we talk about job centres and Job Centre Plus, what people tend to think of is people who are completely unemployed, looking for work and claiming benefits. But in practice, nearly 40% of universal credit claimants are in employment, and there is much more that we can do to help those customers to grow their earnings, whether that's through taking on more hours, by changing their employer, reskilling to take on a new occupation, however it might be. That said, we also know that many of those customers face really significant barriers to doing this. So Baroness Ruby McGregor-Smith report in 2021, I thought highlighted really well how hard it can be for people to break out of a cycle of low pay. So we know that women and ethnic minority and disabled workers are more likely to be in low paid roles across pretty much every sector. There are skills barriers, transport challenges, caring responsibilities to account for. There's often also significant barriers relating to confidence, to perceptions, the lack of mentors, lack of role models. And progression does not come naturally to many people. So overcoming these sort of barriers genuinely needs a whole system approach. And it's naive to think that there would be a golden bullet solution, nor that there would be nor that by tackling one single barrier in isolation to the others, we can have a huge impact. It's more complex than that, and critically, it's one that certainly can't be done by government on its own. Employers definitely have a really crucial role to play here. Let me just say something first of all about the way that universal credit is designed. This is a bit of myth busting, but it's something I'm always really keen to do, which is just to reinforce that UC is specifically designed to ensure that it always pays to work more, and that it withdraws support at a steady rate as claimants move into work. So we've previously cut the universal credit taper, and that means that people keep more of their earnings. And it's really vital just to reinforce that there aren't those cliff edges within universal credit in the way that there were with previous benefits. Our job centres can also play a really critical role though, and we're looking at 2 different ways of doing that. The first is by increasing something called the administrative earnings threshold, which brings more lower earning universal credit claimants into the full job centre support from a work coach, where they can help them address their barriers, connect them with job vacancies and skills opportunities. We've already increased this to 15 hours, equivalent of 15 hours at national living wage. It's going to be increased further to 18, and that brings 140,000 more customers into that intensive work support regime. But the second, and this is genuinely innovative across benefit systems worldwide too, is for those customers above that earnings threshold, we have introduced a voluntary in-work support across Britain, and that gives claimants access to support from a work coach, including a diagnostic assessment of their personal situation and the ability to develop an action plan. And these are able to help people increase their hours, but also give them support on how they could switch to different and more productive, better paid roles. And that offer will become mandatory next year, bringing 600,000 customers into that work coach engagement. It's a big change for our job centres. So we've been looking at we've done trials in the past, randomised control trial, which shows it can increase earnings, but we're looking really hard at how we build the evidence, including through a longitudinal evaluation, to understand that claimant group better. And we've been doing an interesting pilot in Thameside, which is now its second year, looking at how advisors can support participants to upskill, increase their earnings and provide bespoke training. And crucially, engaging with the local labour market so that it's tied very directly with local job opportunities, because that is the major driver in people's behaviours, and especially when it comes to re-engaging in skills training, something that I saw really clear when I was in DFE, and very happy to talk a bit about more in our conversation later. And I think these partnerships are going to be really crucial then to the success of this progression offer. We've recruited progression leads in each of our job centre districts who are there to build those local partnerships with employers and wider, and they are helping already to shape and develop that new offer as we develop it, and how we bring a new approach really to give people in low paid roles a different opportunity around the stability and security of their futures, but critically to help drive further growth in the economy more broadly. I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone else's contributions too, and then obviously having the chance to discuss it shortly. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks, Naomi.
Brilliant, thank you, Ian, and really good to hear that kind of recognition that this is an issue that needs a kind of combination of measures, and you know, employers certainly play an integral role, and good to see also the test and learn approach that DWP are taking in this space. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Ashwin Kumar, who's at Manchester Metropolitan University, who's going to talk about some of the trends that we've seen in employment and progression, and some of the policy and practice opportunities in this space. Ashwin, over to you.
Okay. I can't actually start my video. I'm being told it's that the host have to do it. So if somebody could start my video. Ah, great. I can see you. Right, okay, well, you can see me. Great. Thank you very much, Naomi. And it's really good to speak to you all today. So what I wanted to do is just go through a little bit about some of the longer term trends. One of the things that we're hearing about very much in political discussion at the moment is about how inactivity is the big story at the moment. And it is true that the employment rate is about a percentage point lower than it was pre-pandemic. But it's still worth remembering that today's employment rate at 75.5% is higher than at any point before 2018, and our data goes back to 1971. So we in structural terms, in long term, the long term trend is actually employment is quite high. But accompanying that high level of employment is higher in-work poverty, which has been rising over the last decade that Naomi, you talked about. And also, as you said, that progression is stalling. The analysis of people escaping low pay shows that has reduced over time. So, and of course, you know, as others have said, the problem isn't hourly pay. It's actually the weekly hours that people can secure and the security of those earnings. So we all agree on the need for better work, but what are the barriers to better work? Well, the first thing is that it's far too easy for employers to offer poor jobs. It's as if the Contracts of Employment Act 1963 simply didn't exist for some people in the labour market. For some people on 0 hours contracts, then all an employer needs to do to make you redundant or to fire you is to stop phoning to offer shifts the next week. And I wonder whether the fact that actually most employees still have a contract of employment, still know when they're going to work, and this actually only affects a small proportion of employees, means that this hasn't had as much focus as it should have done. One of the things that we've seen that's quite interesting in recent years is the apprenticeship levy, which of course has its flaws. But what the apprenticeship levy does is it establishes the principle that there's a financial incentive to kind of doing the right thing, as it were, to sort of offering more training. And we've also seen good work charters in places like Greater Manchester that have tried to use a combination of soft power and sometimes procurement incentives to improve the quality of work. But I think we need to have a realistic conversation about what the mix is of regulation and incentives that will start to improve the offer from employers, because at the moment it is far too easy for those that choose to offer poor quality work, which of course then undermines those employers that would rather not do so. Another aspect that I want to talk about is the role of poor childcare and transport in undermining progression. If you look at hourly pay rates for part-time workers, for those with A-levels, they're barely higher than those with no qualifications. So the point is that for part-time workers, there's basically no return on qualifications. The important point about this is that actually, for lots of women, there is an oversupply of skills, not an undersupply. The problem isn't that people haven't had enough training. They've got qualifications, but aren't able to secure jobs that their qualifications would normally merit. And so why is that? Well, part of the picture is poor childcare and transport services. It's fairly obvious that if your binding constraint is to get back to the school gate at 3:15 or to the after school club at 5:30, that restricts the pool of potential jobs that you can do. And if the pool is smaller than it otherwise would be, then clearly your progression opportunities are going to be lower. And so that will be part of the story about why people have to settle for jobs which actually their qualifications might suggest they'd be able to get higher paying jobs. The final point I want to raise, which kind of follows on from Ian's presentation, is what is the role of the DWP, particularly not just in relation to the in-work support that Ian talked about, which is a new offer from the DWP. They're starting to develop that. They have the progression leads in each Job Centre Plus district, as Ian talked about. But actually, the majority of the DWP service is for out-of-work claimants. And the way that out-of-work claimants are treated in terms of employment support can have two potential effects. On the one hand, you can have a very supportive service where work coaches are able to engage with claimants and to talk about what their long-term prospects are, how they could move into a job which is going to give them the greatest chance of progression, and to empower claimants to be able to make choices between good and bad employers. That's one potential story of what happens in those out-of-work claimant interactions. The other story, potentially, is that the compliance-focused approach, where people are being forced to take any job as quickly as possible, actually leads people to take poorer quality work than they would otherwise do. And so one of the questions is, what is really happening on the ground? Some of the political rhetoric actually suggests that the out-of-work support is in the latter camp. And I think it's a really reasonable question, really what's happening on the ground and what effect it's happening. And that's actually the subject of a study that we've just been funded to undertake by funded by the Nuffield Foundation, to look at what the relationship is between DWP support on the ground and people's prospects of good work and progression. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Ashwin. And a really important reminder there to not divorce kind of conversations around access to kind of good work and in-work progression from kind of focus on the support given to out-of-work claimants. And a reminder that we need to look at a cross-departmental approach to these issues too. So thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Anna Ambrose, who's co-founder and director of Workwhile. Anna's going to talk about how we improve pathways for people in low pay and how we support employers to improve access to good work. So over to you, Anna.
Hello, thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So I'll just very briefly introduce Workwhile. We are a not-for-profit initiative. We work with employers to create more good work and to ensure that everyone can access it. And we exist for all the reasons that you've been hearing lots about today. So we know, whilst good work can make the difference between struggling and thriving for individuals, for communities, and for the economy, opportunities to access good work just aren't fairly distributed. We know from Youth Employment UK's Youth Voice Census, the extent to which young people are concerned about being able to access good work near to them. Our own polling has found that 7 out of 8 people feel that there are fewer high quality jobs available than when they started their careers. And, you know, as we heard earlier, that's despite those increases in minimum wage levels. Work, as Naomi said, may be still the best route out of poverty, but it's no longer necessarily the better option in terms of people's mental health and well-being over unemployment. So there's a really kind of critical factor there where the quality of work is poor. We've grown out of a successful pilot called the London Progression Collaboration, or the LPC, in London, which supported employers to create new apprenticeship opportunities for low-paid, disadvantaged and marginalised Londoners. And alongside that now, we deliver a programme of line management training for people managing disadvantaged young people. We're supporting SMEs in East London through a place-based project with a good work health check and some signposting around that, amongst other aspects of work. So the perspective that I bring to this is very practical, very employer facing. And all that work is kind of based on the principle that alongside the fantastic support that exists for individuals, both, you know, through DWP, but also through lots of great third sector organisations, etc., that needs to be matched with the support for employers and especially SMEs to ensure that the opportunities are there for people to access and to progress into. And so based on our kind of practical insights, I want to sort of tackle this question from 2 perspectives, drawing particularly in our work with SMEs. You know, over 3/5 of employment in the UK is with small businesses, so really important that we remember how crucial they are. And, you know, we need to make both more work good work, so improving the availability of good quality work across the whole spectrum of measures. So yes, pay, working conditions, but also autonomy, skills and training, health and well-being and inclusion. And as well as that, we need to improve the accessibility of that work. We know that disadvantaged and marginalised groups are disproportionately likely to be in low paid, unstable and low quality work, and far less likely to receive the training and support that they need to progress in work. And I guess before I kind of share some insights, it's worth saying that broadly speaking, we're working with the kind of willing and well-intentioned end of the spectrum of employers. So, you know, the challenges that we see are those that are faced by businesses who, you know, broadly speaking, really want to do the right thing, do good things for their employees, but are still sometimes struggling to do that. And so on both of those perspectives, both making more work good work and making it more accessible, I think we see kind of the same 3 challenges emerging for SMEs in the work that we do. The first is really simply capacity within those businesses. We're often talking to somebody who either leads the whole business or is a kind of operations director type role with so many plates to spin just to keep that business going. They're firefighting staffing issues, they're dealing with finances, they're filling in frontline roles when people are off sick, etc. So the reality on the ground of managing any kind of change or anything new feels really overwhelming. So, you know, on a practical level, that means when they need to recruit, they use the same channels and methods that they've always used, rather than perhaps thinking differently about how they can make roles more accessible or attract perhaps candidates from a different group than they might normally. They stick with the same workplace policies that have been around as long as, until or unless there's a really critical need to change them. And if they try and engage with something external, so, you know, from the biggest part of our experience, the skills system, and they don't get a call back from somebody, as we know happens all too often, or something sounds complex and time consuming, we just lose them out of a kind of very leaky bucket in terms of those intentions to perhaps improve something or do the right thing or create a great opportunity. The second challenge that we see really having a really negative impact is those businesses knowing where to find the support, advice and guidance that they want. Again, we're working, by virtue of the fact that they've come to us, we're working with employers who have their eyes up and are ready to receive that external input, but still many of them are really very, very isolated, and so much of what's readily available kind of out there for businesses in feels as though it's aimed at those large businesses. And to take a really tangible example, what we then see is that because they don't know where they would go for support, it makes them feel very vulnerable, perhaps taking on somebody who's experienced barriers to employment, because they simply don't know what they would do if that colleague had some additional needs that they couldn't support themselves. And then the last thing I'd highlight is the crucial role of line management. There is so much evidence about the way that it's line managers who make the most difference to people's day-to-day experience of work. And whilst they obviously have to work within the parameters of the organisation, so they might not be able to affect kind of pay levels or something, they can do a huge amount to support well-being and to make work an inclusive experience. Yet so many are accidental line managers and haven't got the support and training to do that. And so whilst there's obviously this place for regulation to kind of raise the floor when it comes to poor employment practices, I think our experience is that there's also a huge role for really accessible, on-the-ground, practical SME-focused support when it comes to kind of raising that ceiling for the most well-intentioned businesses who want to improve, want to make work better, want to make those opportunities more accessible, but don't know where to turn and are just so stretched for capacity to do that. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. Director at business in the community, and you're going to talk about the role of employers in supporting skills development and progression. So I'll hand straight over to you, Ola.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Naomi, and it's great to join you and the panel of incredible speakers that we have today. For those who are not familiar with the work of business in the community, we are the largest responsible business network of over 600 members dedicated to building a fairer and greener society, and we've been supported by His Majesty the King for over 40 years. In my role as Employment and Skills Director, I lead BITC's work in improving social mobility through education, employment and skills. And I do this through a group of some of our members who are leading in this space, and also some of our key partners in government and civil society. And what I just wanted to share today was some of the insights from our Upskilling for All project, which was supported by the Phoenix Group, the savings and retirement provider. And we published this report during lifelong learning earlier on in November this month. And the purpose of the research really was that we wanted to better understand why lower skilled workers were less likely to participate in upskilling than their higher skilled colleagues, and to identify solutions, similar to Anna, to identify solutions to equip employers to support every employee to develop their skills regardless of their starting position. So one of the things that we found, again, which really stuck with me, was that only 10% of lower skilled workers undertook training or development activities in their current roles, in comparison to about 50% of higher skilled colleagues, which again highlights the gap in development opportunities and the need for employers to focus on enabling their employees to develop in their current roles, especially those in lower skilled, quite often low paid entry-level roles. And from our initial investigations, we drew on 3 key themes for further exploration, and it's great to see the alignment between what Anna was just previously talking about. The first theme was the need for an effective data strategy on upskilling. The second was the need to have supportive and supported line managers. And the third was the importance of building a culture of lifelong learning across the business. And just to sort of dig deep into that, on the first one, we saw that businesses who were making the most impact, the most progress, were using data. And this data enabled them to have a better understanding of what their current skills gap were across the organization, and also the new skills, the future skills that the organization will likely need in the next 5 to 10 years. And these organizations really understood the impact of the development opportunities they were providing to their staff, the impact this will have on the workforce and the broader business. On the second one, around line managers, we saw that employers that held their line managers accountable in having those development conversations were making the most progress, and also employers that gave their line managers the capacity, the capability as well, and the motivation to develop their direct reports were also making progress in the progression of low-skilled, low-paid workers. And on the third theme, we identified that it just wasn't enough for employers to provide those sort of learning and development opportunities, but also there was a role for employers to play in empowering the lower skilled employees to engage, and also to factor in the style of learning that was available. As some of those employees who were being targeted might also not have had the best experience of traditional learning settings. So the key point we just wanted to get across through this report was that businesses should not be trying to do everything at once. Don't try and boil the ocean. Focus on one or two things. Starting with the key material problems and the key skills challenges that you need to solve. And this is, and I mentioned, this could be trying to attract, diverse talent. It could be plugging skills gaps or retraining staff, or even retaining staff. And then focus on one of those three key themes, or what those key building blocks that we identified in the report. And this would help you, or help businesses or employers, create a solution to upskill their workforce, and especially supporting those in low-skilled entry-level positions. And I think I'll probably stop there and hand back over to you, Naomi. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ola. Really, really interesting, and builds nicely on what Anna was saying around the kind of role of employers and line managers, and working with businesses too, who perhaps just don't know where to start on some of this stuff. We're going to move now into the Q&A discussion. So please do ask any questions that you've got for the panel in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I know that we've had one question around the role of the National Careers Service, which I can see, Ian, you've answered in the chat. But if I can come to you first, just to talk a bit more about the role of the National Careers Service in supporting in-work progression, particularly as they have an offer for progression support, but also a bit more about other stakeholders. So whether it be employers, unions, third sector organisations, the role that they play and how they might work alongside DWP and are working alongside.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my computer. I hope you can hear. Let me end of your question, Amy. But I definitely got the beginning, so let me pick up that, and then you'll tell me what I missed. So, the National Careers Service. I think there's a key part of this for me, which is there's a general ambition we've got about stitching together better employment skills systems. So one of the things really focusing on with our colleagues in DFE and going through some Pathfinder projects that we've been running is, how do we make it slicker and easier for our customers to access the skills training that they need, whether that's about addressing gaps in functional skills, which we know are a major barrier to employment for lots of our customers, but also accessing the sort of skills programs like skills boot camps that can lead them directly to guaranteed job interviews and so on. So there is definitely a dual role, I think, between the kind of support that our work coaches can do and the sort of additional support through a National Career Service advisor, and then the link into the training system itself, which we're really keen to develop more. And one of the things we hear a lot about in job centres actually is how well that relationship works, but also how much sort of further we could push it. So, the National Career Service can do a lot more than help people with CVs. They can give people advice on what skills they developed before that would be useful in other occupations, about the training options and so on. So it's a really valuable pathway, I think, for lots of our customers. I think then the second thing on those local partnerships, I think what we've been really struck by in DWP is through the Kickstart programme that we ran as part of the response to the pandemic under the Plan for Jobs, and then in the Way to Work campaign that we ran last year, we have really shifted our approach to engaging employers. and to do so much more directly to help broker real opportunities for our customers. And we now have lots of employers coming into our job centres regularly to run jobs fairs, to do job interviews on the spot in our job centres. And we think that is an example of the sort of partnership approach locally that makes a real difference for closing some of those gaps and some of those barriers that that our customers find in finding work and finding better work.
Great, thank you, Ian. Ashwin, can I come to you? I mean, you talked a bit about how things like transport and childcare can kind of limit particularly part-time workers' access to good quality jobs, particularly ones that kind of utilise the qualifications that they have. And what's your view on, I guess, both the kind of role of cross-departmental working in this space, but also the kind of local partnership working that Ian touched on there?
Well, I think that one of the issues is there should be a general presumption that kind of senior jobs are made available on a part-time basis, and that's not yet part of our management culture. There's still a sort of a lot of a view. I mean, I sort of remember doing a project for the British Retail Consortium, and sort of some of the HR directors of the big retailers talking about the pride with which they offered flexible shifts, but that often didn't apply to their supervisor jobs, where Saturday shifts were compulsory, and actually the flexibility started to reduce. And certainly when you look at qualitative research, that's the perception of people, that actually there isn't flexibility, and if you get promotion, then actually sort of that's one of the trade-offs you have to make. So now, I mean, what are the levers that start to address this? I mean, it's partly cultural, it's partly in the sorts of management training, but perhaps in the requirements of good work charters and sort of procurement frameworks, but also talking about and so it's this sort of complex mix between regulation and incentive. So as Anna talked about, regulation only sets the floor, but we still need a conversation about sort of what good looks like. And at the moment, that's kind of happening in kind of with good work charters and in specific areas, but there isn't yet a national conversation about that, and we need to kind of find a way of making that happen.
Great, thank you. And Anna, Ola, I'd be really interested to your views on the kind of role of kind of other stakeholders and the importance of kind of that kind of cross-departmental kind of local partnership approach too, but also on, you know, you talked about kind of how we can support employers to look at what they can do to create more kind of good jobs. Just like to get your thoughts on how you think policy might work to kind of influence and support employers, thinking about kind of influence of employer behaviour and kind of what support government might provide to employers. I mean, we've got lots of kind of good work charters and standards. We often talk about the role of procurement in this space and kind of making the business case to employers too, but really like to hear kind of your thoughts on the kind of role of policy in kind of both influencing employer behaviour but also supporting employers to provide more good jobs. Anna?
Thank you. And I think I'd come back to where I kind of closed in terms of my opening remarks, really, that you know, I think as Ashwin just said, you know, regulation clearly has a role to play in setting what our expectations are of a minimum set of standards, but you know, we will always want employers to be going above and beyond those to provide truly meaningful good work. I think, and you know, that is, I think, where the role of incentives comes in. It's the incentive to go further and do better and do more. But I think, you know, from a smaller business perspective, you know, at the moment, providing the support for businesses to then kind of access those incentives to do what they need to make those improvements. You know, it's not quite anyone's kind of statutory job within a system. There's lots of great work going on out there from BITC, you know, the kind of relatively small scale work that we do, plenty of others in this space. But actually that in itself is quite hard for businesses to navigate. And I think, you know, the role of particularly local government stakeholders in convening that available support for businesses and helping them to know where to go and find that advice, like that feels like a really kind of critical part of making, you know, what's kind of already out there in terms of the infrastructure, but making that serve the needs of businesses and ultimately the needs of employees more effectively.
Right. Ola.
And just to add to that, yeah, I think policy does sort of play a key role. So when we think about maybe another sort of apprenticeships levy is used to support that kind of upskilling, that way of people developing. You know, we've seen some you know, policy announcements around lifelong learning and how people can sort of continue to access finance to help with improving their skills. So I think policy plays a role in terms of BITC. We don't, you know, necessarily lobby government. We talk about naming and faming. So we present the best practice that we're seeing across business, and in a way, you know, government can use some of that to highlight and showcase best practice. So if I could sort of give an example of one of the utilities companies that, you know, we spoke to, and how they've been able to sort of capture and identify the skills gap caused by an aging workforce using data. And then, you know, this kind of gave them two things. It gave them, you know, the opportunity to zero into some of the risks across the business of, you know, having an aging workforce, but also it gave them, I guess more importantly, it gave them an opportunity to better understand, you know, who needed to be upskilled, how they could ensure that no one was left behind, you know, ensuring that the employees who had gaps in training were better upskilled. And this had a material impact on the employee experience and also the employer experience. So I think for us, it's about how does business speak to government as well, and how does government through policy kind of help businesses to improve best practice. So I think it's a bit of both. I think policy plays a role, but also it's about how do we showcase the best practice across business or employers to enable other people to act on this.
Great, thank you. And there's a couple of questions in the chat about the role of the apprenticeship levy. So a question about whether the panel would support more flexibility for the apprenticeship levy to be used for short courses and kind of upskilling of staff to support kind of meaningful in-work training. And another kind of related question, I think, on the potential of wider education providers such as schools and colleges and kind of wider community networks to support progression for adults. So very much on the kind of skills training side and kind of thinking about the apprenticeship levy within that. Ian, given your kind of former role at DFE, perhaps I can come to you first.
Yeah, there's nothing I love more than discussing the apprenticeship levy. So I mean, I guess I used to lead on apprenticeship strategy when I was in DFE for a while, and when I was there, I used to work on adult retraining policy. So two sort of big takeaways I've taken from that, and that still informs conversations I have with employers now. One is there is a loss of flexibility within the existing apprenticeship levy arrangements that I think don't get fully used, but actually generate really fantastic opportunities for employers, especially in the progression space, to both in terms of how they can use the levy to create progression pathways within their organisations, which can be a really brilliant way of taking people out of relatively low skilled roles and giving them a pathway through to better, higher paid, higher skilled roles. But also how they can use apprenticeships as a way of broadening and diversifying their recruitment, so that they are not just, as we sort of see predominantly, using apprenticeships as a way of recruiting in new younger staff, but actually using it as a retraining route. And there are lots of ways that can be done. I think that is a really interesting area. The second sort of point I'll just bring together. I was really struck by Oliver's point in his presentation, which I thought was absolutely spot on, about how do employers use data to understand the skills gaps, both now and in the future. And one of the key reforms that the DFE colleagues have been working on, as you know, over the last years, is the role of local skills improvement partnerships. The whole logic being that actually, if employers can get to a point where they are doing more of what Ola described and being really strong and articulate in identifying the skills gaps they've got, then you can create a better sort of transmission mechanism so that that really drives local skills provision, so that those training colleges and other training providers and so on are really meeting the skills needs. And then maybe the final thing I'd say is having all of that connected to the real job opportunities that are available locally is the thing that really drives engagement, especially for people who are later on in their career, have got a poorer educational background, are more wary of going back into the training system. And it's why in the design of things like skills boot camps that DFE run and sector-based work academy programs that we run, I think the role of guaranteed job interviews is an absolutely crucial way of pulling people through into something they might otherwise feel really reluctant and actually quite, in some cases, quite sort of scared and nervous about going into. So I think trying to align all those different parts can make a real difference as to how that overall skill system can support progression. And that can all be done without actually making changes to the levy itself, in my view. I think that's about making use of what's there.
Great. Anna, do you want to come in quickly on this question? Because I know obviously you kind of have done a lot of work on apprenticeships and work with employers on apprenticeships.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, and I think as a starting point, our work began very much focused on creating apprenticeships for a reason, and that is because within what's available within the kind of skills products, they are a high quality, high impact opportunity, both to help people into work and to help people to progress in work. And there's evidence from the Social Mobility Commission that the greatest kind of pay dividends come for the most disadvantaged learners. So great reasons why and a focus on apprenticeships is so valuable. And the other kind of jumping off point for this I'd take is a round table we held with Minister and with employers of all different sizes, so including some of our large employer partners, but also some of our small business partners earlier this year, discussing this issue of flexibility within the apprenticeship levy. And I think we hear headlines which suggest that what employers want is a kind of free-for-all to be able to use the levy on whatever they want. And actually what came through those discussions was a desire for a really nuanced approach to flexibility. And I think that has a lot to recommend it. The things that employers are asking for were really focused on the opportunity to address very specific needs, whether that's around pre-apprenticeship support for people who come into a level 2 apprenticeship and just need that bit of extra support to transition to be able to kind of meet the needs of that apprenticeship, around kind of wider soft skills support, around the ability to address specific challenges that might emerge for people during an apprenticeship. So I think it was really interesting that what came through wasn't, please let us use the apprenticeship levy on whatever training we fancy. It was much more nuanced in terms of, please help us to use some flexibility within the levy to make apprenticeships as effective as they could possibly be. And I think that's a really kind of different take on how we might think about flexibility within the levy, that perhaps keeps the focus on programs that we know can be high impact and high quality. Obviously, they're not right for everybody, they're not right for every business and every circumstance, but to be able to make them as effective as possible without kind of diluting the impact that we're able to have through them, I think is something that we could perhaps all get behind.
Great, brilliant. Thank you, Anna. We've got literally about 2 minutes left, so I just want to come to Ola and Ashwin just finally for kind of your reflections on kind of where the focus should be, particularly kind of ahead of the next general election. Been lots of calls for a wider strategy for good work. There's a comment in the Q&A that they agree that there needs to be a balance of regulation and incentives to improve access to the quality of work. But what do you think's worked particularly well and what should be kind of scaled? And I guess what would be your kind of, you've got about 1 minute to answer this fairly big question, but what would be your top priority in terms of a strategy for for kind of good, a government strategy for good work, particularly thinking about going into the next general election. Ashwin.
Okay, so the top line really is about empowering low-paid workers. We often think about these things as what can we do for businesses or what can we provide for people? And so part of the issue is, with people's interaction with the DWP, can we empower people to pick and choose between employers and have choices? Can we offer the childcare and transport that empowers people to be able to select between workers? Can we kind of make a skills offer that empowers people to make their own choices about what they want to do? Because I think too much of this is about sort of what we can provide for people, what the rules say you must do and you mustn't do, and what goes through the business. And actually often what will enable progression is low-paid workers actually having the option to say, I can go to another employer who's better, because that will drive up practice by their current employer.
Great, brilliant. Ola, hand over to you for the last word, if you can keep it to within a minute, preferably 30 seconds.
Brilliant, great. Very quickly, three things. It's job design. I think we've already mentioned that, how employers are creating jobs that support people from low-skilled roles. Second thing is around having that sort of regional focus. So a lot of organizations are talking about place-based apprenticeships, supporting employers to do that. And the third thing will be around that absolute mobility piece, and just ensuring that, you know, more opportunities are created for everyone to sort of move up, and not just focusing on you know, certain sectors, but also just that absolute mobility piece is critical as we gear up to the next election. So 30 seconds, there we go.
Brilliant, thank you, well done. And thank you to all of the panelists. I thought that was really interesting discussion and lots of really important points raised there. I'm going to hand straight back to Naomi, who I think is going to take us into the break.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Naomi, for chairing that absolutely fantastic session. And I am sure that we could all have gone on for quite a lot longer as well. So thank you so much. It is now time for a short break. Go make a cup of tea and get ready to join the breakout sessions from midday. There are 3 to choose from: achieving better outcomes for young people, supporting labour market participation through essential skills, and supporting people with health conditions into employment. Joining links for these breakout sessions are in the programme on our website, and now helpfully in the chat function as well. So thank you to everybody. Please do come back at midday, and we look forward to seeing you then. Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you really enjoyed those breakout sessions. I should have said before, but if you don't worry, because they've all been recorded, so you can watch the other ones back that you weren't able to attend. I think it's just been the most fantastic summit. I am so full of ideas and inspiration from today. And so thank you just so much to all of our speakers for contributing to the workshops and for all of the panel discussions that we've had earlier. And there's just so much to pick up on. We got the latest labour market analysis from Naomi Clayton, and crucially, the implications for policy on employment, benefits and economic growth. We then went into a deep dive on employment support, what's working, and where the support just really isn't being as effective as it should be. And then our next panel looked at job quality, and surely supporting people into not just any job, but a good job, and promoting better work should be a priority for us all. And then the 3 breakouts: achieving better outcomes for young people, supporting labour market participation through essential skills, and supporting people with health conditions into employment. Major issues. I'm sure we didn't actually manage to solve all of them in just 45 minutes, but these are really crucial conversations, not least in today's economic
news and climate. What's really struck me is that there's no shortage of ideas, evidence as to what works, and a huge amount of willing across sectors to make the whole system work better for people and for the economy. But making progress can be complicated, and there are and have been many barriers along the way. But in a changing world, it feels like we sort of need to sort of accept and ride with some of that complexity, and crucially keep collaborating across sectors and systems, keep sharing ideas, keep trying to find the same language to talk to each other in. Because we're all, I think, aiming to make life better for people, to make improvements for our society, to have a stronger economy. And I think by working together, by keeping talking, by sharing these ideas, and for using our voice to be pretty strong on where the real need is and where the change needs to happen, we can really achieve our shared goals. And really, it's just too important not to. So that's the big takeaway that I've had from today. As mentioned, all of today's sessions have been recorded and will be available on our website soon, and I think our YouTube channel. We'll also email with a link and invite you to provide feedback for the event. We really would appreciate if you just took a few minutes just to respond to that, because it helps us to shape future events. We really do take that feedback and look at it and use it constructively. And next year, I am so excited already. I know the team are as well, because we're going to have our Employment Skills Convention, and that is going to be in person. We are back in the fabulous city of Birmingham. Registrations are going to open soon, but I can tell you that the date, I don't have a drum roll prepared, but it is 10th of July, and please put that in your diaries now. Thank you again to our sponsors, who are Clarion Futures, Youth Futures Foundation, Edge Foundation, and City and Guilds. And events like this are only possible with their support. And thank you to all of them for supporting next year's convention as well. As you would imagine, planning is well underway for that one. And we're really excited for the first time to be including a housing zone at next year's convention in partnership with Communities That Work. And with thanks to our sponsors, Abri and Sovereign, for that. That really is going to be a special event. And finally, thank you to all of you for joining us today. We really hope you've had a great morning. Finally, a quick reminder that nominations for our Festival of Learning Awards opened a couple of weeks ago. We are looking for inspirational individuals, providers, projects, and employers who've demonstrated a commitment to adult learning, skills, and training. This includes innovative training providers working in partnerships and engaging communities, employers supporting workers to upskill and progress, and individuals engaging in learning to transform their lives. Nominations open close on 2nd of February, and all details are on our website. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons.